Good evening, everyone. We're just going to let folks get connected in here and we'll get started shortly. All right, so it looks like we've still got a few folks trickling in to join us here, so we'll just get started in a moment here. All right, looks like we've got everybody in the meeting just about here, so we'll get started shortly. All right, so thanks everybody for joining us. Welcome to our, I think it's our 6th webinar this evening. So we're here tonight to talk all about the Northwest region for our sport fishing engagement for the 21-22 regulation changes. So thanks again for joining us this evening. My name is Janine Higgins and I will be the facilitator for our session this evening. I also have a couple of colleagues, Rob and Jenna, who are going to be working in the background, supporting some of our technical aspects of tonight. So they will have their videos turned off, but they will be here doing some of the behind the scenes things. So while we normally like to host these sessions in person, we are so thankful to have technology to be able to still bring us together and allow us to gather, even if it is only online during these unprecedented times. Tonight's meeting will be recorded and the recording is going to be posted both on our YouTube account and on the engagement webpage tomorrow. So lots of good opportunities to watch if you aren't able to stay for the whole night tonight. So to start off, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I am joining this evening from Edmonton in Treaty 6 territory. And I acknowledge the many First Nations and Métis whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. I honor and respect the elders of the past, the present, and the future. And I ask that since we are gathering from across Alberta tonight, that each one of us personally acknowledges the Indigenous people of your region. So for tonight, similar to other webinars, if you've joined us over the past 2 weeks, we are going to do some of our housekeeping issues before we move into our presentation on the Northwest region, fisheries management, and then we'll be going into our question and answer section. So we'll have about an hour for question and answer tonight to respond to all of your questions before we close the meeting at 8:30 p.m. So in terms of our question and answer tool, I see a few people have already found it, but if you look at the bottom of your screen on the black bar, you should see a button that says Q&A. So you can go ahead and click on that to open up a white box that will pop up. So that's where you can submit your questions for this evening. We do also have a bunch of pre-submitted questions that people added in when they registered through Zoom. So thank you for all of those pre-submitted questions. We will be starting off our question and answer session by going through some of those pre-submitted questions. So if you have a question that you'd like to see answered tonight, you can go ahead and type it into that box. And because we do have so many folks joining us this evening, we are going to be using our upvoting function. So if you see a question that you like, you can go ahead and click that like button or the upvote button, and that will be one of the ways that we are sorting through questions for this evening. So in terms of what actually goes into those questions, of course, any inappropriate questions will be deleted. So if there's profanity or they're just inappropriate in nature, we'll just remove them from the system. We are going to try and answer a broad diversity of questions on fisheries management questions around the Northwest area of Alberta for this evening. So if we've already responded to a question, and it's a duplicate question, then we'll just dismiss questions that we see coming in that we've already answered, so that we can get to as many questions tonight as possible. So fear not, if we don't get to your question tonight, there's still lots of opportunity to interact with our fisheries biologists and our other staff that we have through our Ask the Expert section on our engagement webpage. So if we don't get to your question and you'd still like to have a response, you can go and check that out. You can also actually see all of the other questions that people have submitted. So you can search by tag. So if you only want to see questions, for example, about walleye or pike, you can click on those tags and you can go through and see what other people have submitted and check out their questions. And again, if you still have a question, go ahead and submit it there. So in terms of who's going to be responding to questions tonight, our lead presenter is Miles Brown, who we're going to hear from shortly here. And he'll be taking us through all of the proposed changes for the Northwest region. And then he'll be joined by our panel. So for tonight, we have a nice big panel again here to respond to all of your questions. So for our senior fisheries biologists, we have Chris, Adrian, and Mike. For our fisheries biologists, we have Christy and Ryan and Ben. And then we have our fisheries technicians, Brian and Cody. And we also have some folks here from Justice and Solicitor General. So Ryan and Carrie are both here with us tonight. Ryan isn't going to have his camera on, but he is here and able to respond on the panel. We also have Dave, who's our Director of Fish and Wildlife Policy, Harvey, who's the Cold Lake Fish Hatchery Facilities Supervisor, and last but not least, Kadon, who is our fisheries manager for the Northeast. Jordan is going to be supporting us tonight in more of a technical role, so he won't be active on the panel, but you will see his little black box show up here, or his face, but again, won't be too active on the panel. So with that, I would like to pass it off to Miles, who is going to take us through our presentation.
Thanks very much, Janine. Welcome everyone, and thank you for taking time to come out to listen to us this evening and ask questions. My name obviously is Miles, and I'm presenting here from Slave Lake, Alberta, and want to respectfully say that we're happy to be presenting from the Treaty A territory here. So first off, this is the Northwest Region Fisheries Management presentation. What does that mean? We've got biologists here, obviously representing Slave Lake, Grand Prairie, Peace River, Edson as this northwest portion of the province. And then, as Janine just introduced, a number of specialists from different areas throughout the province, and our colleagues in enforcement joining us from Peace River and High Prairie. So the slide you guys see here is just to give you a brief overview of the presentation we're going to go through. I'm going to spend a few minutes and talk about Alberta's fisheries management system. Folks may have attended some of the previous webinars, and so we'll just take a minute to sort of reconnect with that and recall kind of what is the means by which Alberta goes about managing fisheries. We're going to talk about fisheries management notifications, so things that we're looking to change for next year, April 1, 2021, where we aren't seeking feedback, but just want to let people know what's going on. And after that, we're going to talk about a couple lakes where we're looking to actually get feedback from folks. So as Janine mentioned, we've got online surveys. We really encourage folks to take those surveys and provide us feedback. We're going to go through some of the information on the lakes that we are asking questions about online. We'll summarize with some changes there at the end, and then we'll get into the Q&A portion here. So Alberta's fisheries management cycle. Fisheries management is not a static activity. It is something that we move through in a series of steps and phases each year. A lot of that kind of starts and ends with implementing regulations. So the way anglers obviously experience our fisheries, we look at the reg guide in April and we can see what changes have happened on the land base. when we make changes in fisheries management, we follow this cycle. So we go out on the land base through the course of the spring, summer, fall, and winter. We perform assessments on lakes that can be either using index nets or talking to anglers or completing electrofishing surveys, gathering data on the distribution and abundance, size, age, a bunch of metrics that allow us to get a snapshot, a picture of how our fisheries are doing in responding to land use pressures and management changes we're implementing. From there, we take that information and we have a bunch of different tools that allow us to sort of categorize it. Our number one tool is called the Fish Sustainability Index, or FSI. There's information available on that online for people that are interested. And effectively, it's sort of a report card for our fisheries. I've got a slide later on that touches base on that a little bit to refresh people's memory on what that looks like. And it allows us to say, what is the sustainability risk to a fish population and fishery? So if we have things that are in lower abundance or have some threats or challenges that are impacting the fishery, it would be at high risk. And if we have fisheries and populations that are doing well, they're abundant, we're seeing a structure that we want to see compared to a desirable objective or outcome, it would be moderate risk, and then low risk obviously would be when things are doing really, really well. Once we've interpreted our data and been able to look at what that risk assessment and that categorization is, we look at what is the objective for this fishery. That could be a lake, that can be a river. We assign those to our most important recreational sportfish species. And from the objectives, we look at what regulations are we applying in this instance to a recreational fishery that allow us to meet, either get to or sustain meeting that objective. Those are the things that we bring out to events like this, and ideally, as Jeanine said, when we're in person, using tools like our online surveys to access folks that we appreciate Albertans have busy lives, the opportunity to weigh in on different platforms, consultation and stakeholder engagement, incredibly important for us to get that feedback from our stakeholders, from Albertans, let us know what they're seeing, what they'd like to see, and from the options we're then able to assemble and present for a fishery, how people would like to see their fisheries managed. And from there, implementing those regs and then reflecting them back in the regulation guide. As a part of that cycle, as I mentioned here previously, we have some changes that are coming out in the next year here, some of which are providing more opportunities and some of which are looking at actions that we need to take because we've seen some declines where we need to implement conservation and recovery actions to hold and grow fisheries. So starting off again, these are local examples here. So Nipissing Lake, for those that are local to Slave Lake or might travel to fish this, it's just north of the town of Slave Lake off of Highway 88 and east. People predominantly fish this lake in the winter, and in the past has had quite a popular northern pike fishery. So we surveyed Nipissing Lake in 2012 and 15, looking at how many anglers were present, what that fishery actually looked like and what the population looked like. Nipissing Lake was doing well. It was meeting the objective at the time of a sustainable harvest fishery. So there was some very nice pike that were in there, obviously being winter only. It wasn't a large amount of angling effort that was on the lake. And so people quite valued those pike that they could eat, but also those quality and trophy sized fish. We did consultation in 2017 to sort of solidify that and say, and ask anglers, do we want to see Nipissing Lake's pike population managed as a quality harvest opportunity? Anglers were supportive of that. And so to essentially just nudge that population up, Nipissing went to catch and release for a couple of years, hoping to grow that density slightly and just ensure that we had those extra years for pike to continue to grow larger and older. And so Nipissing will be opening back up in April of 2021 for a quality fishing opportunity. The regulation there will be 1/75 centimeters. That aligns with regulation that's in our northern pike recreational management. There's relatively new recreational management frameworks for both walleye and pike. If you type those into Google, Northern Pike Framework Alberta, Walleye Framework Alberta, they should pop up on one of our websites, alberta.ca. And they provide sort of the background and regulation structures for how we're managing those two species. The next lake I want to talk about in terms of notifications is Monogamy Lake. People obviously familiar with the fisheries here will know Monogamy Lake is connected to Lesser Slave by the South Heart River. Monogamy Lake's very popular fishery. There's a provincial campground there. If you haven't been up, it's a wonderful lake to visit. It's a man-made structure. It's been enhanced through time with different control structures to raise that lake level and provide more of a stable fishing opportunity. Through time, it's provided a great pike fishery and post some walleye stocking. Those walleye have now been able to naturalize, reproduce, and started to provide a great recreational fishery that's actually managed as a quality fishery. Regrettably, through time, we've seen some harvest of pike that has resulted in populations starting to drop. They've reached a level where we now want to take action to see those populations come back up. Again, aiming back towards that place of sustainable harvest and offering a harvest opportunity for anglers. This is where I want to connect back into the Fish Sustainability Index. So when we think about our fisheries, if we're assessing them, again, whether that's a river or a lake, and through these different methods, as we have, if you think about the abundance of fish in a lake as sort of a bank account, when that is middle of the road or doing really well, it's really robust. We have more options, more opportunities, different targets and things we can manage for, and different regulations we can apply. As the resiliency in that fishery begins to degrade, as we see changes and challenges with it, opportunities and options kind of come off the table, and eventually we get to a place where we just need to take strong action in order to sustain or recover those fisheries. We've heard from a number of Albertans that it's important to have reasonable or high catch rates and that opportunity to actually have fish there when they go to fish. So we've seen a change in monogamy from previous surveys. In 2015, we completed a fall index netting survey there, and things were going pretty well. The graphs that you're seeing on the screen here, on the bottom, these two graphs, on the left-hand side, you see circles along the bottom of the graph. Those represent the catches that we got in our survey nets, and sort of the peak of that curve tells us what the average catch rate, relative abundance of pike in the lake was. The target is to see that curve in the yellow, and it was great that we had that curve moving into the green, signifying moderate to low risk. The graph on the right-hand side here demonstrates what the size structure, so what did the fish in this lake actually look like at the time we took this snapshot. Along the bottom of the graph here, you see different sizes. Those represent the length of fish in millimeters. If you knock a 0 off, it'll give you that in centimeters. And my apologies, we commonly use these in centimeters, and folks that are quite good with conversions could put those into inches. But we were seeing the black line represents the data from the lake in the survey. The red line represents an idealized population, so an average population. The fish, the pike in monogamy in 2015 were doing well. They were matching that. But 5 years later, after we've had open harvest under 2 different regulation types, we just saw that abundance start to drop a bit. And so we're implementing a catch and release regulation for 2021. Once we see that population recover, again, aiming for sort of middle of the road, we'll likely open it back up to that same objective, or test that objective with Albertans and say, yeah, here is back to a sustainable harvest opportunity. Those are the 2 lakes where we have noticed things that folks will see as a change in the guide here for April 2021. The next few slides are going to talk about lakes that we right now have online as part of our survey, where we're really seeking to gather feedback from Albertans. So these are our consultation lakes. There's options that are out there for these water bodies, and we really like to hear back from the public as to what direction we should take so that we're managing these fisheries to meet people's expectations. The focus of these slides is on 2 lakes, North Wabasca Lake and South Wabasca Lake, that are located in the community of Wabasca-Desmarais. It's about an hour 40 minutes northeast of Slave Lake, and for folks that may have come up from Athabasca or Calling and fished these lakes, located within the traditional area of the Big Stone Cree First Nation. And these lakes have been quite popular fisheries for our Indigenous fishers, Indigenous users, and recreational users for quite some time. Both lakes have a fairly long assessment and active management history. They've supported fisheries for a very long time. And regrettably, these lakes have required lots of active management to correct some overfishing activities that happened many decades ago here now, and regrettably at times when we've seen populations go down, it is often a bit of a slow recovery to see them come back up to again moderate abundances, where we know that fishing effort from different user groups is not going to have a degradative effect on those populations. So the two graphs that you see on the screen here, the one on the left represents North Wabasca Lake, the one on the right represents South Wabasca Lake. The lines represent those FSI risk categories, and the bars that you see are representative of the catch rates that we have observed in our survey nets, where we do our surveys in the fall to determine what's going on with these populations. So as you can see, South Wabasca Lake has had 4 surveys through time, stretching back as far as 2006. It certainly has had work done on it prior to 2006 using different techniques and tools, talking to anglers, observing commercial catch, talking to Indigenous fishers. This represents our best standardized data set with a common method. And so through a series of management actions that have included things like a reg change from 43 centimeters to 50, the implementation of conservation closures, some important discussions with the Big Stone Cree First Nation, the suspension and eventual removal of commercial fishing, we've been able to see walleye populations in both the North and South Lake take really positive strides towards being moderate abundance, moderate risk, where we want them to be to offer sustainable harvest opportunities to Albertans and ensure we're meeting our needs to provide fish for subsistence and cultural purposes for the Indigenous fishers. But for a long time, things were kind of struggling there. And so again, positive things have been coming along there. The black bars indicate a growth in adult abundance in these lakes as a result of taking a management action, allowing some time to go by, ensure that we've seen recruitment and a reduction in mortality and a growth in those populations. We did some work to kind of model where we would expect the population to be as of this year relative to the target, the bars that you see on the far right of each graph that sort of identify, again, we're not looking to see these fisheries grow through the roof or reach the same abundances as we've seen in some of our highest populated lakes, but at a level here at moderate abundance, moderate risk, where we know a sustainable harvest to multiple user groups can be maintained without any negative consequence to those populations. Positive things that have come along with the management actions that have happened on the Wabascas and the folks that have provided us information. We see a broad size structure. So these two graphs, similar to the ones that we saw for monogamy, again, focusing on walleye. The axis along the bottom gives us a measure of size, and this is in millimeters, but again, knock that 0 off and you can think of it in centimeters. The red line represents a modeled population, so an idealized population for middle of the road, sort of a moderate abundance fishery. The black line on both graphs represents the data that we observed from North and South Wabasca Lake in 2017, the most recent survey. And so there are positive things that we see there. We've seen consistent recruitment coming into both lakes. So fish spawning in the spring, laying eggs, those hatching and growing and entering the fishery. It's a fairly wide size distribution. So we see fish getting out to 50, 60, and 70 centimeters. The age of those fish, we've got walleye living in there till 15 years of age, which is great. We've seen walleye in our surveys in some lakes live out into their 20s, so they can be quite a long-lived fish. And important to remember as well that in Alberta, and certainly in northern Alberta, what we typically see for female walleye is it often takes between 5 and 7 years for a female walleye to reach maturity for the first time. And so when we are looking to recover and grow fisheries, when we see these positive signs, it's a nice little sort of fact to tuck away in the back of our minds that those first 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 years, those fish have not actually replaced themselves. They haven't reproduced to contribute back to that population. So when we're setting regulations, when we're evaluating those options, we need to just pay attention to the fact that there is sort of a critical mass of those fish that need time to get to a mature age where they then start to contribute to the population. And so maintaining them for several years as adults can be really important to make sure we get that constant recruitment coming in. But again, positive signals that we have older fish, we have big fish, we have mature fish, we have evidence of recruitment. And so we are seeing positive signs in both these lakes. Focusing on the North Lake here for a bit, the northern pike in North Wabasca Lake in the past have offered tremendous fishery. It is well known locally for containing large quality and trophy-sized individuals, and in the past has had a moderate overall abundance of pike present in the lake. In the last few years, we've seen declines in some of the pike population, certainly from different levels of harvest and the use of different harvest techniques. So pike have been there, and as they have declined a little bit here, again, we've sort of reached a threshold where risk was kind of high in 2017. And so in the North Lake and in the North Lake, we took conservation actions in 2017. It went to catch and release for walleye and catch and release for pike, with the intent of growing both of those populations. The South Lake, and I'll maybe even just move back a slide here, South Wabasca Lake actually went to catch and release for walleye. I mean, you can see here that after the initial survey in 2010, abundances were quite low. This was very concerning and dangerous as far as maintaining a population in that lake for these fish. And so catch and release was implemented recreationally in 2014 to, again, give those fish the maximum opportunity to grow and recover. So we've had 3 fishing seasons in the North Lake of catch and release for both walleye and pike. In the South Lake, we've had 7 seasons of catch and release for walleye. We've seen positive signals of growth in both lakes. And so now we've been in conversations with folks in the community, and we've heard from anglers saying, hey, I'm seeing good things. I'm seeing fish on the end of my rod that are large, and it seems like things are going well. Is there opportunities? Is there actions that we can take here while we still see these fish grow and recover that would allow us the potential to harvest fish? So recognizing that both walleye and pike in the North Lake and walleye in the South Lake are still in what we would describe as a high risk to sustainability state, we have opportunities that we can look at to provide some harvest while still looking for that objective of sustainable harvest and an action of population growth. So the table you see on the screen here represents 3 options for walleye. These are the options that you can see on the online survey. And so there are sort of 3 paths, if you think of them as almost like a Google Maps, and there's 3 different routes that we could take to get to our destination. The first one is to maintain the catch and release action that we have here. So that's obviously sort of the quickest route to recovery. It provides the lowest fishing mortality on those fish in the system and the maximum opportunity for them to recruit and grow and increase in abundance. Obviously, the trade-off there being it's very limited recreational harvest opportunity. I'll take a moment to mention that while we're talking about recreational fishing here, the Indigenous Fisheries have remained open to make sure we're meeting those responsibilities to treaty rights. So that harvest opportunity is currently still available. A second opportunity that we could look at for recreational fishing would be to go to the previous regulation or size regulation of 50 centimeters and have 1 over 50. So that would be an open harvest fishery. Obviously, that would, again, afford recreational harvest, and so there would be some mortality ascribed to that. We would have to pay attention to what the fishing effort is in that case, where we know we're still looking to overall grow the abundance of fish. If that effort and harvest was high and started to impact those efforts, we'd have to revisit that as a regulation. We'll continue to monitor these fisheries regardless, and if we saw signs of that, that would be bringing things back to the public to say, hey, this is what's happening, and we may need to take additional actions to ensure that, again, we see that trend of up and holding in sort of a moderate range. But the benefit would be that there is fishing opportunity for folks that are visiting or living in the community under recreational fishing. A third option for walleye would be to use the special harvest licenses. So folks that fish lakes in other parts of the province may be familiar with this system. It would be in its current version using a harvest tag. So in that case, we can ascribe basically a quota. We can determine what a number of fish to take out of each of the lakes is that is an affordable harvest and set that threshold. We can choose fish from across the whole size structure, which allows us to fish selectively from the population. So it is sort of a have your cake and eat it too style regulation, where we can afford that limited harvest opportunity to some folks, but at the same time we know that we are less likely to be impacting those overall goals of population growth. For northern pike in the North Lake, we would be looking at two options: maintain the existing catch and release regulation that's there, again, sort of that fastest route to seeing that population recover to moderate abundance, moderate risk, and then we would look to open it up to the quality fishing objective, aligning it to South Wabasca Lake, and appreciating that folks have enjoyed catching those bigger fish and maintaining bigger fish in the lake. And the second option would be to simply align it now and again offer that opportunity at one fish over 75 that would align with South Wabasca Lake and down the road neighboring Sandy Lake, each of which offers the other two offer an existing quality fishing opportunity with high abundances of large fish. So again, in summary, for what we're looking at here, notifications this year, Nipissing, we're opening up an opportunity, affording that quality pike harvest. Monogamy Lake, we've seen some decline in pike populations and are looking to take a conservation recovery action, bring that back up to middle of the road, and then test with the public what harvest objective people would like to see implemented there. If it's sustainable harvest, it would open back up to the existing regulation. And then on North Wabasca Lake, we're looking at opportunities for walleye and pike management. So 3 choices for walleye and 2 for pike. And in South Wabasca Lake, the same choice is available for walleye, given that the South Lake is still open right now for pike harvest at quality reg at 1 over 75. And with that, we are through the update sort of Northwest presentation on what we're looking to gather feedback on, and happy to start taking people's questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Miles, for that great presentation. So I will invite the panel to join us if you want to turn your videos back on, and we'll get ready to move into our question and answer section of the evening. So as mentioned before, thank you to everybody who pre-submitted questions, and I see lots of really great questions coming in through that Q&A tool as well. So just a reminder, there's lots of questions that you can scroll all the way down to the bottom of to be able to view all of them, and click that upvote button for questions that you would like to see answered for tonight. So starting us off, we're going to use some of the questions that were pre-submitted through the Zoom registration, and also actually combine them with a few questions that have already been submitted tonight as well. So the first question, we had 2 that were submitted that were very similar from Darren and Terry, wondering, how does Alberta manage Indigenous fisheries? And I see there's a question that's come in tonight from Scott as well. Just wondering why the Alberta sport fishing community is being regulated when Indigenous communities continue to fish in the northern lakes.
I can answer this question, Janine, and get us started off. You're right, there were a number of pre-submitted questions on this topic. So great question. Pleased to speak to that here tonight. So folks that may have attended earlier sessions would have probably heard some similar openings. So Indigenous fishing rights are protected by the Canadian Constitution, and we incorporate them into Alberta's Fish and Wildlife Policy. Allocation of fish harvest in Alberta is governed by a scale of priority. Number 1 is conservation. So we want to make sure there's enough fish in the lakes, in the lakes and rivers to ensure long-term sustainability. The second priority after that is Indigenous use and honoring those Indigenous rights. Recreational and sport fishing use is followed as the 3rd priority, and economic use as the 4th priority. And economic use would be an example of, say, a fish derby or a competitive fishing event. In a healthy, sustainable fishery, fishing opportunities would meet not only those conservation needs, but they would allow for allocation to all of those uses. Obviously, in all cases, we may be in different phases of status, as Miles alluded to earlier in his review of the fisheries management cycle. So in Alberta, Indigenous peoples have the rights to fish for subsistence for themselves and their immediate family members. So that's the practice of the right. Indigenous fishing does require a domestic fishing license for all treaty status or registered Métis harvesters that they would then obtain. And they then have the option to use rod and reel or a short largemouth gill net that have a number of conditions that, that are applied as part of that license. The government of Alberta publishes those conditions and rules for fishing to ensure that conservation requirements are met. We do things like gill nets managing through minimum mesh sizes and seasonal closures, as well as rod and reel fishing is managed with conditions such as conservation-based size limits, so minimum size limits, as well as seasonal or area closures. So, you know, in short, consultation with Indigenous communities would also typically occur with those communities and where there might be a potential infringement based upon needing to address conservation issues on that. So maybe I'll stop there, Janine. I think hopefully that covered the questions that we got submitted on that. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Kadon. So the next pre-submitted question that we received was from Rick, wondering, is the government going to stock more tiger trout in the north?
Yeah, I got that one, Janine. Thanks for the question, Rick. Yeah, so since tiger trout have been added to our stocking toolbox, we have received lots of positive feedback and support from anglers to see tiger trout stocked in a variety of lakes throughout the Northwest region.
Oh, I think we lost your audio,
region.
Cody.
Oh.
I'll just get you to turn your video off for a second here while you're responding.
Yeah.
There we go. Let's try that.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Is that better?
You bet.
Yeah. So thanks, Rick, for the question. Yeah, again, since tiger trout have been added to our stocking toolbox, we have received lots of positive feedback and support from anglers to see tiger trout stocked in a variety of lakes throughout the Northwest region. We currently stock 8 lakes in the Northwest with tigers. For those of you unfamiliar with our region, these lakes include Millers, Schumann, Lily, Moonshine, Dollar, County Sportsplex, Twin, and Stony Lakes. Lakes are typically selected that have both public support for diversifying the stock fishery and a strong chance of overwintering fish with a low chance of fish escapement. These lakes are also used to promote destination type fisheries to assist in spreading out angler effort and provide a diversity of angling experiences to the public. And since this program is still in the early phases, we are continually assessing the success and support of adding tiger trout to our stocking plan. Additional lakes may be added in the future if there is that continued public support. And thanks again for the question.
Great, thanks, Cody. We'll get you to leave your video off just in case your internet is a bit slow this evening. So just for folks on the call, Cody will still be on the panel, but we'll just turn the video off so that hopefully that helps with our audio issues for this evening. All right, so our last pre-submitted question that we'd like to go through, again, we received several from folks, Greg and Brad and Taylor, wondering, are the regulations for Lesser Slave Lake changing for the next fishing season?
I can answer that, Janine. So thank you very much for the folks that have asked questions about slave. And those that I can see in the chat field there. So yes, we completed a survey on it here this last fall. We will not be making any changes for April 1, 2021. Our intention is to use this next year to take our time to analyze that data, look at some historical trends, and then because of the nature of Lesser Slave Lake, obviously it is quite a sizable water body. It spans 2 MDs and there's a number of towns and hamlets, and the usership of it is very robust and complex. We want to ensure that we have lots of time to engage with stakeholders, Indigenous stakeholders, recreational, to provide opportunity or provide options that we'll look at here in this next year on how we will move forward with objectives and management. So stay tuned, 2022.
Great, thanks, Miles. All right, so we will shift now into the sort of fully live Q&A. So we'll be going through the questions that have been submitted this evening and putting them out to the panel for responses. So the first one that we'll go to here is from Doug saying, due to the size, location, and accessibility, Uticuma Lake cannot be harmed by angling pressure. Being prone to winter kill, why is the limited harvest walleye not allowed?
Hey, Janine. Hi, Doug. Thanks for the question. So Uticuma, you nailed it. It's a giant lake. We are dealing with about 30,000 hectares, a little bit more than that. It's quite a large water body. We do have a few different user groups on that lake, and you're absolutely right. We do have persistent summer and winter kills. So over the course of the lake's season and life, we've seen it ebb and flow. We don't get annual kills, so we're not expecting one of these every year, but it does go through cycles where we do get winter kills. Walleye in that lake are unique. So we've got a very low density of walleye in that lake. When we've sampled that lake in the past, we see beautiful fish, but we see low densities of them. So we consider them a high risk to sustainability. When we last consulted with the public in 2018, because of these low densities of fish, we asked the public, would you prefer liberal harvest? So that would be harvest the fish that are there, or a catch and release to preserve those fish for a little bit longer. So to be able to catch those fish, see those fish, release those fish. When we got responses back from the public, we got the signal that they would like to see a catch and release for walleye on Uticuma Lake. In the future, we'll be going back and we'll be surveying that lake again. And we may or may not see an improvement in that walleye fishery. And there might be another opportunity to offer a harvest on Uticuma in the future. Hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Christy. All right, so I'm going to group two questions together here that are both on perch, actually. So the first one is from Kent. In the past, perch have been typically looked at as just eater fish and to fill your limit every time. Once word spreads, that lake gets hit hard. Can the limits be lowered or even put in a slot size for them to keep those jumbos in the lake that took so long to get that big? And then the other question on perch from Ty, are you able to put in place some regulations to improve the perch fishery?
All right, thanks, Janine. I'm going to take that question. Yellow perch management in Alberta is an interesting topic. We definitely have a very passionate segment of Albertans and anglers that look for good perch fisheries on an annual basis. Perch management can be difficult as the animal itself can be a cyclical in its nature, going from periods of boom and bust. They're also able to meet two trophic statuses typically within a lake. They can either be feeder fish or active predators. The direct mechanism to get them out from a feeder fish to an active predator where there's sizes that we can angle them is not exactly known. But the province does has yellow perch on the list to develop species management frameworks coming up. At that point in time, we will evaluate the different FMOs that are appropriate for a species like that and matched it to their biology. And then we will also assign associated regs. We won't stop there. We'll come back out to Albertans and we'll gather the feedback prior to finalizing these frameworks. So that's the long answer. The short answer is each bio within their regions will have certain fisheries that will have perch as their management objective. We are actively managing those perch fisheries by reducing bag limits. We haven't really looked at size limits or slots at this point in time, but we'll save that for a fulsome review during the management framework development. Thanks for your questions, Kent and Ty, and thanks for your involvement.
Thanks, Adrian. All right, our next question comes from Luke. The 1 over 50 centimeter regulation has not worked in almost every lake it has ever been in. So why is this offered as an option for North and South Wabasca? These lakes have such potential to be managed as trophy lakes, and I do not support any regulation that promotes the legal harvest of older fish, pike or walleye.
I can answer that, Janine.
Thanks, Miles.
So Luke, thank you very much for supplying the question. So I think maybe the first thing to talk about as far as regulations go, obviously there's a couple different types that we can use. There's minimum size limits. There are harvest slot limits, protected slot limits. There's a variety of those tools that are in the toolbox. I think a key message is there's no such thing as a silver bullet regulation. Under different circumstances of effort and harvest, pressure, and what the status of a population is when you apply a reg, everything can perform well relative to meeting an outcome or be challenged. So when we looked at the walleye and pike frameworks in 2017 coming into 2018, I would say we could point to a number of fisheries where minimum size limits were very successful in building abundance underneath the size. So at 50 centimeters, female walleye have between 3 and 5 years where they can spawn and reproduce and essentially replace themselves in the population. So at 50 centimeters, 3 to 5 years for a female walleye to spawn and replace itself. In lakes where we see like moderate or low effort, we commonly see growth well out past the size limits. Switching from the wabascas to lesser slave is an example. At a 43 centimeter minimum size limit, we see walleye that will reach out to 60 and 70 centimeters. If you think back to the presentation I showed, so for North and South Wabasca, the size structure that was there shows fish already getting out to 60 and 70 centimeters, which is great. And in the years where fishing, recreational fishing was open, North and South Wab both had a 2 fish over 50 centimeter limit. So we know fishing effort there was not high enough that it was cropping off those fish at 50. And so we had escapement, we had growth into those older years. Certainly bigger fish and older fish are attractive in a population. They produce more eggs per individual. But as they tend to be the lower proportions, those age classes to kind of go down and down and down through time, we also get a large contribution of eggs, recruits, into the fishery in those first years of maturing females. So we balance those two things, healthy, lots of eggs from bigger, older fish, as well as lots of eggs from a larger number of smaller maturing fish. And as a strategy, we like to have all those things present in a size class structure so that we're not reliant on just old fish. If we looked at something like a harvest slot limit there, which I'm not saying is off the table by any means, but again, there's conditions under which something like that would be effective. If you have fishing pressure that's low enough that those young fish grow into the protection of the old slot, become old, become large, that's great. If your effort is high or the nature of the population of it's structured such that you don't have a lot underneath of that, you can have challenges with providing an actual opportunity, or you might actually not be protecting that many fish. So their contribution overall in egg mass can be a challenge. We look at all those things in consideration when we apply regs to lakes, and certainly under high effort scenarios, we know one of the challenges of a minimum size limit is things can crop off. But the benefit there is we always tend to protect some number of spawning fish. And so we know we have large volumes of eggs that can come into a fishery. But I would say in the case of North and South Wabasca, and we are looking at slot limits across the province right now on 38 walleye lakes to evaluate sort of their performance under a range of scenarios. We see different effort and them apply to populations that are at different levels of risk, so we can evaluate how well that tool works. We could consider it in the future on these lakes.
Thanks, Miles. Our next question comes from Megan, saying local folks have said that the closure of the commercial fishery on Lesser Slave Lake has negatively impacted sport fisheries. How are whitefish and walleye populations being monitored and reported on?
Janine, I can take that question, and Miles, you jump in here as well. I know the question from Megan does refer to Slave Lake here as well. So thanks, Megan. Great question. I think one of the things since we closed commercial fishing in 2014 is there has been questions around are we seeing, because of the closure of the fishery, additional both response from a population level as well as opportunities for recreational and Indigenous users as a result of that. So I think the piece that I would suggest, or I would come back in response to that, is we have done assessments post-commercial fishing on a number of these water bodies that previously had commercial fishing on that, Lesser Slave Lake included. I think what we've predominantly seen across the province with those assessments is we have seen recovery. Sometimes that recovery has happened quickly and sometimes less so. In some cases, as Miles alluded to in his last answer, some of those have resulted in additional harvest opportunities, whether that be through slot limits. We've also seen across the province where previous stocking efforts using walleye stocking and rehabilitation measures has also been improved based upon the closure of commercial fishing. So on Lesser Slave Lake, again, I'll let Miles take a small crack at this as well. We actually have seen recovery certainly on the East Basin in recent years as well. We do still have some challenges on the West Basin in regards to walleye populations, and in general, when we closed the commercial fishing season, we actually depressed whitefish populations in many of those water bodies, Lesser Slave Lake included. So we are, I think, seeing recovery on those. Again, sometimes it's slower than what we'd like to see, I think, as recreationalists and anglers out there, or as Indigenous users who are relying on that resource. But overall, what we see, and I think what we hear from anglers, is we are seeing positive responses from that closure, which is what we predicted. So Miles, is there anything you'd like to quickly add to that?
Yeah, Kaydon. So maybe even just a word there, Megan, on the assessments that we do. So the fall index netting that we do, those nets are set in a random fashion. We set them in different depth stratums in the lake. They contain panels that run from a very small mesh at 1 inch all the way up to 6 inch. And as a tool, they give us these snapshots of things like recruits, small baby fish, the juvenile fish, mature fish, and old fish. And so we get trend data from a number of species, as Kaydon's identified. I think something that's really important to identify about other aspects of fisheries is commercial fishing was regionally a very important activity, something that a number of people in the different communities here participated in, but it was a type of fishing, and so was not in and of itself a way to manage a fishery. It was a harvest. It was the removal of fish, and like any other type of fishery, required regulation. We saw very dramatic declines, both the commercial fishers, the catch rates in commercial fishing gear, as well as our survey gear, showed that when we were coming into 2012 and then 2014, very sizable drops in whitefish abundance in both the West and the East Basin. And so, those got to a level where the West Basin fishery was actually suspended in 2012 because we were concerned about that decline. So there is a long road to go for that population to even come back up to levels that it was at previously in the late 90s and early 2000s, when it was being fished quite heavily at really high abundances. So it's important to think of it relative through time and what that looks like. It's a great thing to hear that people are catching whitefish on rod and reel now in the winter. People see them on their cameras, and that's a good thing. They're there and they should be seen. And so, yeah, it is a process that will take time for fish to come back up. And that's the tool that we use to look at all these different fish populations. Whether we commonly talk about walleye and pike a lot, they're two of our most provincially sought after fish species. But that tool also gives us information on other fish.
Great, thanks, Kaydon and Miles, for that. So the next two questions, I'm just going to group them together again here. So first one is from Jason. I've been actively attending meetings like these since they have started and intentionally tried to follow the regulations and changes and reasoning why, and I'm still confused at how these decisions are being made. If we are managing Nipissing Lake for a quality harvest, why are we allowing harvest of fish over 75 centimeters? Not against harvest of fish, but in the opinion of managing for quality harvest, should protect those larger fish. What has happened to protect our trophy size fish? And then there's another question here from Scott, just asking, Nipissing Lake has seen a massive decrease in fish size by putting a limit that takes the breeders out of the lake. Just wondering sort of where that comes from. And just stating as well that the lake is difficult to catch fish over 4 pounds.
Hi, Janine, I can answer those.
Thanks,
So thanks, guys, for the questions. So angling at Nipissing Lake, we have seen over the last couple of years a general rebuilding with the catch and release regulation that went into place in 2018. Our goal was to start rebuilding some of that pike stock. We understood that there was a drop in what catch rates were being seen by anglers, and as well, we noticed that drop in some of our regular assessments of that lake. So our objective for that lake when consulted upon was quality harvest. So quality harvest allows for fish to be harvested within the population, but it's a little bit different than, say, a trophy objective for that fishery. So fish over 75, addressing that answer for why would we take those and does it affect the breeding stock? Similar to Miles' answer earlier, we see a large portion of the breeding fish and eggs and recruitment coming in from a population from that middle section of the population as well. We have a few older fish that do contribute a large quantity of eggs to that population, but we see that same amount or larger in egg quantity out of the middle few ranks of the population, which are generally more abundant than our older fish, who as they age, end up aging out of the system. So when it comes to some of these engagements and how we are making decisions like this, one of the big things we like to do is engage with anglers. So similar to what we're doing tonight, our online surveys and some of our in-person meetings in the past, we had an opportunity to gather information and talk about these lakes specifically. So from that information, we distill and help guide our recreational fisheries management objectives. I hope that covers your questions combined. Thank you for the questions.
Great, thanks, Christy. So next up, we have two similar questions from David, actually. So has AEP looked at enhancing existing spawning habitat or adding spawning habitat to maximizing fish population production, specifically at Monogamy, Snipe, and Hague lakes? And what are the walleye stocking program plans for Monogamy, Snipe, Hague, and Sawn lakes?
I can answer that, Jean. Thanks very much, David, for those two questions. With respect to enhancement of spawning habitat or those lakes, currently there are no plans in the works for that. And similarly for the walleye stocking program, currently those particularly Snipe and Hague have got very good healthy populations of walleye, and additional stocking would not really be necessary for those lakes. So.
Great, thank you, Chris. All right, so we have a question here from Ed saying, at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about the fisheries management cycle. Can you provide timelines for each of these steps?
I can speak to that, Janine.
Sure, thanks, Dave.
Hi, Ed. Interesting question, because I think, in terms of the rate at which that management cycle is implemented really depends on the scope of the work required. And I'll give a couple examples to kind of illustrate what I'm getting at there. So if we are undertaking a process like we expect to do in the not distant future with regards to, say, perch, for example, and undertake a province-wide assessment of the sort of the status of our perch fisheries. That is that part of the management cycle where we're basically assessing fishery status. And to do that for a species at the provincial scale is going to take a fair bit of work. It's going to take a few folks getting together, forming teams to basically gather up and compile and analyze the data we have for perch. And once we do that, once we can start to put our perch populations into categories according to our approach, our Fish Sustainability Index approach, then we're going to want to share that information with the public. And while we're doing that, start to have conversations about what management objectives we want to attach to various perch fisheries. What kind of types of perch fisheries do Albertans want? So that will allow us to prepare the basics of a management framework for perch. And as we build that, we'll continue to want to share that with Albertans. And then the next conversation will be around the management tools that we would use to achieve those management objectives, to get to that diversity of fisheries on the landscape, for perch in this case. So we would have further conversations with Albertans about the various options that our science informs us would be effective tools to achieve those management objectives. And then we would have a process where we now want to start to make selections at a water body by water body scale of management objectives and regulations, and start to complete and implement the management framework for that species. So as you can well imagine, that process could likely take months, right? And that would involve a fair bit of dedicated manpower resources. Now, if we're talking about delivering on the management cycle for a water body, really we're talking about weeks, not months, certainly not years. And you know, if we do a fishery assessment in the fall, we can have the analysis done very shortly and the information made public by, you know, prior to Christmas in that given year. And then we are doing what we do now. We move into engagement to talk about the status of the fishery, what the management options are, what the management, what the tools are that are prescribed to achieve those, what the options are. And then, you know, we take the information from the engagement work and we balance that off against other information that we receive, and we start to prepare the package of regulations for implementation for the spring the following year. So that's a management cycle that basically, well, with the subsequent monitoring for success, will occur within a year. So we're talking, you know, months to years potentially for big chunks of work, and weeks to months for like water body specific work. So I hope that helps.
Great, thanks, Dave. So Jason, I see you have a question here. Just wondering, are there concerns over the water table in the headwaters of the Little Smoky since the energy companies have secured such a large allocation for deep well injection water? So this is a question that we'll defer to the Alberta Energy Regulator, and we'll follow up with you after the webinar. So they're the lead ministry that deals with topics like this. So again, we'll get back to you on that question following the webinar. So next question here is from Brad. Why in Lesser Slave Lake is the population of whitefish and tullaby left to be unchecked, no commercial netting, and thus threatening the other native fish species?
I can answer that, Janine. So thank you very much, Brad, for the question. And so just maybe one quick comment on wording there. So both walleye, or pardon me, whitefish and tullaby or Cisco are native to Lesser Slave Lake. So obviously the lake itself has you know, a robust community of fish that's in it. Again, I kind of mentioned this earlier on. So when we were moving towards the end of commercial fishing, you know, starting in 2012, we had seen a marked decline in the relative abundance of whitefish in Lesser Slave Lake. We saw catch rates in the then commercial fishery in the fall, where that fishing was taking place on the spawning beds, dropping dramatically within a season where those fish were typically coming into their spawning grounds. We were going, and those fishers who were very skilled in finding and fishing fish were seeing these drops in a place where typically fish are trying to come into them. That was correlated as well to changes in catches we saw in our survey gear. So people have been concerned. Oh, well, you know, we used to take hundreds of thousands of pounds out. Geez, what's happening now? Really important to note that coming into 2014, when the closure occurred, Slave Lake was the whitefish populations in Slave Lake were being seen as in decline, at high risk. And so we are in a rebuilding phase. And if we were to think of that as terms of, well, what's the abundance now versus the year 2000 or the year 1990, when we were seeing those, you know, high harvest coming out, the consequence of that had compounded over time. And so the abundance of those fish is just not what it was even then. It will be a long time before we see that abundance track back up to those historical numbers. And again, important to remember that, like before, so if we think about Lesser Slave Lake, you know, 100 years ago, early 1900s, commercial fishing as an activity didn't start until about 1915 by like settling people that had come into the area. And so that is, again, a type of fishery that was able to happen on a lake where populations were robust. So we would expect to see, moderate and high abundances of those fish in a natural circumstance. That's why it was able to support those fisheries for as long as it was. And even with that, we've seen big cycles through time where, again, some of those fishing activities have resulted in drops. Closures have needed to occur, populations have rebuilt. And so while there is no longer commercial fishing, there's the opportunity for a growing recreational fishery. We have a number, there's 5 Indigenous communities on the lake that engage in fishing activities to meet their cultural and subsistence needs. So I would not say that it is an unchecked activity. And additionally, those whitefish, as well as the Cisco, serve as a very valuable fish to the community there, feeding predatory fish like walleye and pike at different life stages. And I mean, a recipe for growing large trophy-sized pike is often having a coregonid base, whitefish and tulubi or Cisco that they can feed on. So yeah, they are fish that we will continue to track in our surveys, continue to manage, and understand that there are harvest opportunities going on them right now. And if we did see those numbers start to reach levels that were commensurate with other lakes in the area where we have higher numbers of whitefish, Snipe is a good example, other lakes in the further to the north of Slave, again, those systems operate comfortably with those densities of fish. So we wouldn't attribute an issue to that necessarily, but definitely a surplus stock that meets the needs of those that are fishing it.
Great, thanks, Miles. Our next question comes from Jason. Based on the shoreline habitat of Swan Lake near DeBolt, it has been suggested in the past to stock 15 to 20% brown trout to the rainbows. Has the attitude towards a single species mix at Swan evolved with the recent push to stock multiple species?
Right on, Janine. I'll take that one as it's in my area. Thanks, Jason. I'm sure we've had a few conversations on the phone about this, but for everybody on the webinar, let's just review. Swan Lake is a stock fishery just south of Sturgeon Lake, and it actually attracts anglers, surprisingly enough, from out of province, BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. I've seen anglers coming from the States to fish with friends in Swan. And why is that? Swan has been currently managed as a quality stock fishery. What does that mean? A certain proportion of the population of stock trout that we have in there grow to a size of greater than 50 centimeters. And I personally have held multiple 9-10 pound rainbows out of that lake. AEP over 3 or 4 spring seasons, we put nets in and assessed that population to ensure was it meeting the objective of the QSF. And as we were doing that, we ensured that we talked to the anglers as we encountered them to get an understanding of satisfaction. So we could put that parallel with the data sets that we were seeing and what the anglers were saying lakeside. Unfortunately, with a single species fisheries like Swan, it is currently meeting just about everybody's expectation, just about. It is providing food fish for the pan fryers, and it's providing some very large fish for our competitive anglers who like to chase with a fly rod. At this point in time, because of the satisfaction and the population is meeting management objectives, I'm not considering multi-species for Swan. We have other fisheries very close in range. East Dollar is one of them, multi-species fisheries, and we have a few others smattered across the province, and especially and most for surely in our area. So anglers have a selection of where they want to fish, able to travel for what species. I know my son and I, that's one of the things we do, is what list of species want to go for, and then we head out to those lakes. So at this point in time, Jason, Swan Lake is really performing as expected, and by my assessment, it's really satisfying a lot of anglers. I really appreciate your question, Jason, and thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. So next question here is about Fawcett Lake from Brad. So we never use up all of our tags, nor does many that we know. There should be a way to alert you of the number of tags that don't get used. How could this be better managed?
I'll take that one. Thanks, Brad. This is actually Miles and Christie's area. So Miles and Christie, if you want to hop in and add some stuff at the end, Fawcett specific, please feel free to do so. I'm going to talk more about the tag process and how biologists come up with how many tags that they put out on a given lake. So at a given lake, the number of tags that are available to an angler is determined by surveys that are done on that lake and how many fish are in each of the size categories. The biologist also then estimates how many of those tags they think will get issued and used by anglers. So prior to the last few years, we didn't really have information on exactly how many people successfully use their tags, but it's now going to become mandatory to report your catches similar to harvest surveys for any other type of animal during the hunting season. So we'll have even better information on that. And we base the tag numbers on that to assume that there's a certain proportion of people will not fill their tags. And so that's how we account for people who are unsuccessful. So please fill out your surveys when you get that request coming your way. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ben.
This is Miles. I just again, thank you, Ben. Great answer for the system there. And it just once we have that information and we understand what that success rate is, again, that's where we can make alterations at Fawcett Lake, but nothing really to add at a lake level from that. So I appreciate it.
Great, thanks, Miles. Another question from Jason. Can the Edson staff give an update on the rehabilitation of Athabasca rainbows in the area? Is there still a genetically pure population available for stocking?
I could take that one, Janine.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for the question, Jason. It's getting pretty lonely in my window here, so this is really nice. So with regards to the Athabasca rainbow in available stock, if you're asking about whether or not we have genetically pure Athabasca rainbows in our hatchery system and ready to roll out, the easy answer for that one, or the quick answer for that one, is no. However, if you're asking about whether or not we have pure Athabasca rainbows on the landscape that potentially could be used for restoration stocking in the future, the answer is yes. So we have relatively recent information on all of our watersheds throughout the Athabasca rainbow trout range, and we circulate these on fairly recent or a fairly robust nature. So we have a really good idea how many fish there are in the watersheds, and when we do those inventories, we actually collect genetic samples and analyze those. So we have an idea where pure populations are now and where they could and should be in the future. So if and when we need to do restoration stocking, we'd have an idea where those donor populations could be for stocking. Thanks, Jason.
Great, thanks, Mike. So I have a question from Ray here saying the CPUE from government sampling for Lesser Slave Lake Pike has been low for the past 10 years at 1.7 in 2010, 3.6 in 2014, and 2.2 in 2020. Based on government FSI, would government be considering closing harvest of pike in Lesser Slave Lake?
I can answer that, Janine. Thank you, Ray, and clarifying some of the pieces there. Obviously, the nature of the question is a little more technical for our jargon. So CPUE, for folks that are reading that going, oh, what's that mean? It stands for catch per unit effort. And so that is when we set our survey nets, we understand a catch rate, how many fish are being caught by the net within a set time period following our standard for that. And so those values tell us information about what we understand the density of those fish to be in the lake, and then that ties back to our sustainability index of that report card. So 5 being green and 1 being red. So yeah, Ray, you've got a great point, which is we know that slave, the pike abundance has been very low for a long time. We've done a number of recreational angling surveys or creel surveys on slave, reaching back from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and sort of mid 2000s. And we know that on slave pike harvest recreationally has never been a high driver. The decline that we saw was predominantly tied to some historical approaches and practices around commercial fishing. At one point in time, we would see harvests of pike that were in sort of the hundreds of thousands of pounds, and in the era and at the time, that was the desired objective, to harvest those fish in different fisheries in the spring when they were in tight spawning, and as a quota species. When we saw sort of a reformation of commercial fishing in the year 2000, that changed how we were managing that, and we started to see those quotas transform into tolerances and decline through time, with the focus being on whitefish. On the backside of that, we know that that population was dropped to a level, and then really struggled to come out of that from there. So it's nice that we are. I mean, it is a very large lake. It's 120,000 hectares. So we know to see really sizable growth in abundance, fish per hectare, how many fish are in the lake, will take a long time for that to track up to these levels where we would expect it to be at a high or even a moderate risk. So to your question, will we be considering a change to the regulation? Potentially. We need to dig into that data, determine how, determine a little bit more around that data. And we know that the reg right now is not well aligned. It's 3 over 55 centimeters. And so if we were looking at our objectives, we would look at that and say, well, really, pike have been managed with a regulation that kind of talks more about a very liberal, a high harvest opportunity. We would continue to test that with the public. We will have conversations with Indigenous fishers to determine the value of that fish and the importance of seeing it recover. And then our ultimate options that will come out to the public will stem from some of those things. So stay tuned. But yeah, we will seek to take actions again to get to some of those endpoints that we desire, and we'll look for feedback from the public on what those are.
Great, thank you, Miles. We have a question here from David. Why wouldn't you offer a slot, even 50 to 55, if it is more restrictive than 1 over 50, or then lower if sustainable, such as 45 to 50?
I'll take that one.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks for that question, David. As mentioned, putting a slot on from 50 to 55 would be more restrictive. Currently in the lakes that we have a 1 over 50 situation, they're lakes that can sustain those types of harvest levels. That's why we have the minimum size on there. It's our least restrictive tool that we have in the box. And right now we're getting direction to increase harvest opportunities for people. So ideally we wouldn't be taking them away if there are enough fish making it over 50 centimeters for people to harvest. The discussion about possibly moving the slot down to a 45 to 50 is an option, and it's something that we're exploring currently on a variety of lakes throughout the province. I don't know how many exactly we have at 45 to 50 in the province, but I know at least in the Grand Prairie area in the Northwest, we have both sturgeon and Iossagen with that regulation. And we'll be assessing that over the next 5 years to look at how well it performs. And if we get support for that style of regulation, it's something we could potentially look at using on other lakes in the future if it would support that sustainably. So thanks for your question.
And if I could, I just want to tag on to that. I appreciate that, Ben and David. It is a great question. So it's looping back to a statement I made during the presentation there. We have a variety of harvest slots. There's 38 lakes in the province that are currently carrying them. And I think it is a really valuable discussion to say there is no silver bullet regulation. We derive different values and benefits from different regs, but it is important to look at each lake and what's happening in that fishery, what the effort is on that fishery, and how we expect that reg to perform. It's very much worth noting with a harvest slot limit, if things kind of go wrong, those fish that you protect, again, they will age out of the fishery and and you just go away through time after they've recruited. But if that effort is really high or something happens there, it tends to even like a minimum size limit just truncate to the lower end. So these regs, when we're thinking about them, important to consider all those dynamics that are happening at a lake, and sometimes it's easy to just assume, oh well, fish will always move through, or there will be fish there that are being protected, and that's where we have to be very specific when we apply those tools, and make sure that we talk about the trade-offs and set up expectations well.
Great, thanks Miles for adding on to that, and thank you Ben. So I have a question here from Megan saying, does AEP have data on the harvest of fish by Indigenous Albertans? Any estimate of what that fishing pressure is? The earlier submitted comment suggested that there is over-harvesting, but your response was only that the right to harvest is protected under the Constitution. Can you tell us whether that harvest is unsustainable and or represents a large harvest or fishing pressure? It's worth clarifying when this comes up. And then Megan also submitted another comment just lower down in the list saying, just for context, I'm a scientist and I work with Indigenous communities. I find that people have opinions on Indigenous harvesting rights that are not supported by data or evidence. So sometimes because no one actually has the data.
Janine, I can answer this question, and appreciating that Megan's looking for clarification here, probably on one of my earlier submissions here, or answers. So thanks, Megan. I'll try to be brief here as well. So in regards to your first question, I think there might have been 2 or 3 in there. Does AEP have data on the harvest of fish by Indigenous Albertans? So Indigenous harvesters are certainly spread very wide geographically across the province, and I think that's also reflected in the amount of effort. So obviously, it's difficult to monitor that level of effort and harvest. I think the one piece that I would like to say is we certainly do, based upon some of that effort or that risk we talked about as it pertains to, is there a potential conservation risk? That effort in regards to monitoring also then kind of ramps up so that we can ensure that that conservation requirement is met. We engage typically early and in most times often with Indigenous communities if we do get to those points. And we've got a lot of examples, and certainly in my career, I've got examples where we've worked quite closely with Indigenous communities when it comes to assessing harvest on those water bodies. And that can be through programs like voluntary harvest. It can also be where we've got staff on those water bodies assisting in gathering that information. So the quick answer is it can certainly vary, Megan. A lot of those times it does depend on what that conservation risk might be under those water bodies. It probably is also worth stating that by and large, the Indigenous effort in Alberta is quite modest compared to recreational harvest. I think one of my colleagues provided me recently is in terms of domestic fishing licenses in Alberta, we issue roughly around 3,000 annually. This past year alone, we're over 300,000 resident angling licenses. So often that isn't where the risk is or where we need to look at restrictions. For the most part, it is in that management of the recreational harvest, even though a lot of times we as anglers might not see that when we're out on the lake individually, but cumulatively, that's certainly where most of that effort is. So I hope that clarified things, Megan, as well. So if not, I'd be happy to chat later. So.
Great, thanks, Katon. So I have a question from Jason. How much value is placed in the public responses received during engagement periods? What process is utilized to prioritize the requests? And when does the science override public pressure, which may not always be the correct action?
That's a really good question, Janine. I'd like to answer it if I can.
Please, Dave. Okay,
great. So, Jason, I really like that you asked that question because really, that speaks, I think, to the merits of this exercise that we're in right now. So, one thing I want to get across is that we don't come forward with these management options without having put a lot of thought into I guess the merits of the engagement and the need to discuss those options. Fair bit of information goes into the evaluation of the options, and it's not just the fishery status itself, but we also take into consideration the availability of fishing opportunities, the diversity and availability across the landscape. So in terms of the feedback that that we get, like the weighting and the value of it, when we put an option forward in like an online survey like we're doing right now, we're presenting viable options, perfectly viable options that we sincerely want feedback on. And we do take that information, those proportional responses, you know, in support, not in support, and to what degree supporting or not supporting, we do take that. And that is an important piece of information that we use to inform our decision-making process. So it carries considerable weight. And other forms of interaction where we can get that kind of information about preferences and values and perspectives carries a fair bit of weight itself. And we don't do that lightly. The other question, the other aspect of the question that I really like is your question about at what point does the science take over? And I want to emphasize that at no point does science take over. Science is a tool that provides information. We are the decision makers. We work with you to make those decisions. Maybe what you're getting at is at what point does the information so clearly point to a management direction that that really there's not a lot of conversation required. So when our science does clearly indicate that a fishery is in a very high risk state and conservation of that fishery. So it's a native fishery, its expectation is it's kept on the landscape, self-sustainable, perpetuating opportunities for us to use the fishery in the future. Conservation's number one. When our information very clearly indicates that it is in a very high risk state and it needs to be recovered to fulfill that conservation mandate, that is when that information informed by science becomes so compelling that it really doesn't require a lot of conversation. It's a policy matter. It is something that that is provided to us as a mandate by very high level policy, both at the federal and provincial level. So we orient our management action toward that. We're not coming to the angling community talking about options. So science informs us about the population status. It informs us about the level of risk, the likelihood of the effectiveness of management actions, and other information comes to us that's very important too about what are the trade-offs, who's using the fishery, how is the use of the fishery being managed and balanced right now, what do we need to achieve in terms of dealing with some of those trade-offs. So I think I hope that answers your question. I really want to reiterate that science again is just a tool for putting information into a decision-making process that's assisted by our collaboration with you. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. So we have a question from James. Why can't we restock our Alberta lakes with walleye and pike, which everybody wants? Is the fry from those species hard to hatch?
I can provide a response there, Janine. So James, thank you very much for the question. I think in short answer, I would say, yeah, one of the objectives that was actually for this year that was kind of muted by COVID was to see some spawn takes happen at least one lake in the province and bring walleye back into our hatchery system. I'm also going to lean on my fellow panelist, Harvey Pollock here, who is one of our staff from the hatchery system and can speak far better than I can about the capacities there and how that part works. But what I can say is there is an intent to actually stock walleye into certain water bodies in the province. Again, focusing on those water bodies where we might see the most immediate benefit from those. I think there is some water bodies that were identified for those last year during our open engagement sessions, and some materials that still exist on our website that say, hey, this is where we're looking for that opportunity. In terms of pike culturing, again, I'll ask Harvey here. I don't know that we've had that program in the past. I know we've transferred pike in the past where there's been some issues around summer or winter kill and potential blockages in native streams. So those actions absolutely can be taken. And I think the biggest thing to look at there again is the intention of the use. So, stocking fry is an example in a lake like Lesser Slave Lake. We would expect to see, we would need to stock an incredible volume of fry for those fish to mature and then be detectable in a fishery, versus if we were putting fish, say, into a southern reservoir where the natural capacity for those water bodies, given that they're controlled, for using water for other purposes, means that reproduction and self-reproduction can be quite limited. We might expect to see those fish show up in that system more visibly. So, it is a tool. It's an important tool. We're very fortunate to have 4 culture facilities in the province and the Cold Lake Hatchery, which can hold those walleye fry. But we need to be very, I think it's important that we are strategic and selective in the use of that so that we get the maximum benefit out, and anglers that are going to those fisheries can really see the consequence of that action being taken. Harvey, what am I missing?
Not too much. I'd just like to mention, I guess, some of the capacity we have in the province. As you mentioned, Cold Lake Fish Hatchery is the only hatchery in our 4 facilities that is set up to incubate walleye eggs. We have done up to 90 million eggs at one time in the 80s. We certainly can do it. It just has to become a management objective. As far as pike culture is concerned, it's quite similar to incubating walleye eggs. It's the same process. We've never tried it in the Alberta system that I know of, but it is an interesting concept. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Harvey and Miles. So we'll just take one more question this evening. And Barry, I see you have a question about Calling Lake, which is actually a great segue. So Calling Lake is in our Northeast region, which we're having a webinar for tomorrow night. So I'll defer you to hopefully join us tomorrow night or catch the recording to learn more about Calling Lake. So for our last question, we have one from Ray saying Sturgeon Lake used to be a good pike perch fishery. The 2020 fin sampling resulted in a pike CUE of 2.5 and no perch were caught and few lake whitefish. Why have these fish species declined, and does the government want to increase these populations?
All right, Janine, that one's in my area again. I will take that question back against the clock here. I'll break it out. So lake whitefish, one of the reasons we've seen decline was through an increasing quota through the commercial fishery. 2009, we put a suspension on the commercial fishery in sturgeon. The commercial fishery went from a 2-day fishery to get their full quota to over 2 weeks, and they barely got near the quota. These are strong indications of population decline. I did a fulsome review of the commercial fishery in sturgeon from 9 to records as far back as I could find records, 1930s. That lake fished sustainably at 20 to 30,000 kgs. For some reason, in the 2000s, commercial fishermen were able to get the quota up, hoping that they would be able to pull a number of those fish out and allow the rest of those whitefish to grow to very large. Unfortunately, they did grow larger, but they were only a very reduced number of fish. Unfortunately, that commercial fishery was then suspended to allow the population to recover. And yes, we are looking to recover these species. Lake whitefish is currently at catch and release. Now, flipping over to perch, back to my initial perch are a hard one to manage in their cyclical nature. If I were to run a shore net along sturgeon at any point where I, get along the shore, I would pull up bucketfuls of small perch. Me and my son, again, we do that in our spare time quite often. There's not a good understanding and direct connection of how to get those perch out to large sizes. Sturgeon does have a reduced bag limit as one means to recover the perch population. So sorry to rush that question, Ray, but back to you, Janine. Thank you.
Janine, I just want to really quickly add on to that too, and just clarify that our fall index netting method has not been calibrated for lake whitefish and perch. So it's important to consider that and need to be very careful about making any kind of assessments between lakes and certainly between years, even within a lake, with regards to those data. And at some point in the time, we'll be calibrating that method to those species, but that hasn't occurred yet. So.
Great, thank you, Dave and Adrienne. All right, folks, so that brings us to the end of our evening tonight. So I just want to say thank you, of course, for spending your time with us and asking so many great questions. Of course, we have our survey that's open until February 8th at 9 a.m. And that's really where we'd love to hear from you in response to the proposed changes that Miles took us through this evening and that the panel discussed. We also have lots of additional opportunities. So we had mentioned Ask the Expert before. So if we didn't get to your question tonight, or if we had to defer it, that's a really great place to come and reconnect with our biologists. We also have fact sheets that are posted for each of the proposed regulation changes. So if you're looking for a little bit more follow-up after the fact, you can find those on the main engagement webpage. And we have one webinar left. So again, for Calling Lake and other water bodies, if you're interested in joining us, we'll be here at 7 p.m. tomorrow discussing the proposed changes for Northeast Alberta. And that webinar will also be recorded and posted online as well if you're unable to join us. And last but not least, we always invite you to follow us on Facebook in terms of getting involved with some of the great work that our fisheries biologists do. This is a great place to interact with us and also hear about the stories in terms of what we're up to throughout the rest of the year. We also have Family Fishing Weekend coming up on February 15th through 17th, where you can fish without a sport fishing license, but all regulations still apply. So with that, once again, we'd like to really thank you all for joining us this evening and for all of the great interactions, and we hope to hear from you soon.